A truth long buried is finally uncovered. But can it heal the wounds of the past? Sophie and Richard stand at the crossroads of redemption and loss. Will they find peace, or is it too late for forgiveness? The camera opens with a haunting shot of a misty graveyard, the early morning fog clinging to the ground like a shroud of sorrow. The sky is a soft gray, hinting at the first light of dawn, yet the world feels suspended in time. The air is thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. The camera slowly pans across the scene, capturing the rows of weathered gravestones, some barely legible from years of neglect. A soft wind stirs the mist, adding an eerie sense of abandonment to the already somber atmosphere. In the midst of this quiet, desolate place, a lone figure kneels by a grave. The camera lingers on her for a moment before slowly zooming in, capturing her every movement with heartbreaking detail. This is Sophie, her face pale and streaked with tears, her clothes ragged and ill-fitting, as if the world itself had forgotten her. Her long, unkempt hair falls around her face, further obscuring the grief that is evident in her eyes. She holds an old photograph tightly in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. On the other hand, a worn-out locket dangles from a thin chain, its surface scratched and faded from years of neglect. Sophie's sobs echo through the cemetery, each one carrying the weight of years of sorrow. She rocks back and forth, her hands trembling as she traces the name on the gravestone. But the name is unreadable. The stone is old, eroded by time and neglect, as though even the earth itself is trying to hide the past. Sophie's voice, low and filled with anguish, breaks the silence. "Why did you leave us? Why didn't you come back?" There's no answer, only the silence of the graveyard and the wind that stirs the mist. Sophie's shoulders shake as the grief spills over, and for a moment, it feels as though the world itself has paused, holding its breath to honor the weight of her sorrow. Her words hang in the air, unanswered and lingering like a bitter wind. The camera cuts to a wide shot of the graveyard, showing Sophie alone, as though she is the last living soul in this forsaken place. Her mourning is so intense, so raw, that it feels as if she is mourning not only a loved one, but an entire life lost to the unforgiving grip of time. As Sophie clutches the photograph tighter, her lips quiver, barely able to speak the words that seem to rise from deep within her. "I can't do this without you. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." The agony in her voice is palpable, each word an echo of a life that has slipped through her fingers, leaving her with nothing but the cold, empty grave. In the dim light of dawn, Sophie becomes a symbol of loss, a woman who has faced hardship, suffering, and rejection at every turn. Her tears fall silently, as if the very earth beneath her feet has turned its back on her, and the cold, indifferent stones surrounding her are the only companions she has left. She is a ghost of the past, wandering aimlessly in a world that seems to have no place for her. As the camera shifts focus, it moves to the tattered belongings Sophie has scattered around her. The photograph, its edges curled with age, shows a much younger Sophie, smiling beside a man and a child. The picture, though faded, holds a warmth that contrasts sharply with the desolation surrounding her now. The locket, though worn and cracked, gleams faintly in the dim light, holding something precious inside that only Sophie knows. The camera lingers on her hands, calloused from years of hardship, but there is a tenderness in the way she holds these possessions. They are her only connection to a time when things were different, before the streets became her home, before the world turned its back on her. These relics are the only reminders of the family she once had, the life she once knew. The backstory of Sophie unfolds like the slow unraveling of a tragic tale. She is a woman who has been abandoned by the very world she once belonged to, a victim of circumstance and choices made long ago. Her life was not always this way. Once, Sophie had a family, her husband and daughter, living in a small, humble home where love and laughter filled the air. But as time passed, the world around them grew colder. Sophie's husband lost his job, and the bills piled up. Desperation set in, and one day, without warning, he left, vanishing from their lives without a trace. Sophie was left to pick up the pieces, struggling to raise their daughter alone. But as the years wore on, the weight of responsibility took its toll. Sophie did her best to provide, but the hardships were unrelenting. Slowly, like a thief in the night, poverty crept in, taking away everything she once held dear. The small home was sold to pay off debts, and Sophie found herself homeless, wandering the streets with nothing but the fading memories of a life that seemed so far removed from the cold reality of her present. The grave she weeps over, though unnamed, holds a deep significance. It marks the final resting place of her daughter, the child she could never save from the cruel forces of fate. Sophie's daughter died at a young age, a casualty of the harsh life Sophie could not protect her from. And now, Sophie is alone, holding on to the only things that remain from the life she once had. The photograph and the locket, symbols of the love and loss that define her existence. The camera shifts focus again, this time to a figure watching from a distance. A caretaker, his features obscured by the mist, stands at the edge of the cemetery, puzzled by Sophie's presence. His worn uniform and weathered face suggest that he has been tending to the graves for years. Yet Sophie is an unfamiliar sight in this quiet, forgotten place. He watches her for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he notices her strange behavior, her muttered words, her tears, and the cryptic phrases she speaks to the grave. As he steps closer, the mist seems to swirl around him, and a chill runs down his spine. There is something about Sophie that doesn't quite fit, something about her sadness that feels too deep, too personal, to be merely the result of a passing moment of grief. The caretaker's curiosity grows, but he remains hesitant, unsure whether he should approach her or leave her to her mourning. As the camera lingers on the caretaker's face, his expression is one of silent concern. It is clear that he is not accustomed to such raw emotion in this quiet place. The cemetery is a place of peace, where the dead are left to rest in silence. Yet Sophie's presence disrupts that peace, her sorrow too palpable to be ignored. A low whisper escapes his lips as he wonders aloud. Who is she to you? Why does she grieve so? The answer remains a mystery, hanging in the air like the mist that surrounds them. Sophie's anguish and the cryptic nature of her mourning create an unsettling sense of uncertainty. What is the true story behind the grave she weeps over? And what is it that drives Sophie to return to this place, day after day, with nothing but her memories and her sorrow? The camera lingers on the caretaker, his face filled with an unspoken question. In the distance, Sophie's cries grow fainter, swallowed by the mist that continues to creep through the cemetery like a quiet specter. The atmosphere grows heavier, as if something dark is about to unfold, something hidden beneath the surface of Sophie's grief. The caretaker steps back, uncertain of what to do next. His gaze never leaves Sophie, and in his eyes, there is a flicker of recognition, a sense that he knows this place, this feeling, from some distant past. Perhaps he has seen it before, or perhaps he simply senses the storm that brews on the horizon, a storm that will soon change everything. As the screen fades to black, the haunting image of Sophie kneeling by the grave remains etched in the viewer's mind. The mystery has only just begun. As the mist continues to hang thick over the graveyard, the scene shifts with a subtle shift in tone. The camera moves away from Sophie, leaving her alone with her grief, and turns towards another figure entering the cemetery from the distant gates. Richard Lawson, a man in his late 40s, walks with a purposeful stride, his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestone path. His appearance contrasts sharply with the weathered surroundings, his tailored suit and expensive watch gleaming in the muted light of dawn. The sharp lines of his face, framed by neatly combed dark hair, reflect an air of confidence that Sophie's broken figure could never hope to replicate. Richard walks with a sense of quiet authority, as if he owns the very ground beneath his feet. His crisp, immaculate appearance paints a picture of a man who has everything: wealth, power, influence. Yet as the camera follows him, there's something unsettling about the look in his eyes, a distant sadness that lingers beneath his composed exterior. He approaches a grave that stands a few paces away from Sophie, and the camera zooms in on his face. There is no surprise or shock in his expression, just a deep, unfathomable sadness that seems to have etched itself into his very being. Richard Lawson's life has not always been as perfect as it seems. Beneath the polished veneer, there lies a story that he has buried deep within, a story of loss that he returns to year after year, seeking some semblance of peace that never quite comes. He stops at the grave, his eyes scanning the weathered stone, and for a moment, he stands in silent contemplation. The name on the gravestone reads Eleanor Lawson, his late wife. As Richard's fingers gently brush over the inscription, his thoughts seem to drift into the past. A soft sigh escapes his lips, and his eyes glisten with unshed tears, but he quickly blinks them away, regaining his composure. He never shows weakness in public, and even in this quiet, secluded place, he struggles to maintain his dignity. Richard visits this grave every year, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, a ritual he has maintained since her tragic passing. It's a private moment, one he keeps to himself, yet the weight of his grief is evident in the way he stands there, unable to tear himself away from the grave. For Richard, the cemetery is a place where he can remember the love of his life, the woman he lost too soon, and the life they had planned to build together. But even in this sacred space, there's a lingering question. Why? Why did she die? And why, despite everything he's accomplished, does the ache of her loss still consume him? As the camera lingers on Richard, his thoughts seem to deepen. The woman he loved so dearly is gone, and in her place remains only an emptiness that refuses to be filled by time or wealth. He wishes he could move on, that the legacy of their love could offer him some solace, but it hasn't. The sadness, the guilt, the unanswered questions, they all weigh heavily on him, and he feels as though he is running out of time to find the answers he so desperately seeks. Just as Richard steps back from the grave, lost in his thoughts, a sudden noise catches his attention. It's a soft, fragile sound, like the crumpling of paper, and when he turns, his eyes widen slightly in surprise. Sophie, her face still streaked with tears, has collapsed to her knees on the cold ground, her sobs growing louder with each passing second. She clutches the old photograph and lockets tighter to her chest, as if they are the only things holding her together, her body trembling as the grief consumes her once again. Her face contorted in pain as she cries out, unaware of the world around her. Richard's eyes flicker with hesitation. His first instinct is to walk away. After all, the cemetery is a place for quiet reflection, not for the spectacle of someone else's sorrow. But there's something about Sophie's presence, the rawness of her grief, that pulls him in. For a moment, he stands still, watching her from a distance, his mind wrestling with his own thoughts. He's not accustomed to being around people who show such vulnerability. His life has been one of control and distance, a world where emotions are kept in check and appearances are everything. But as Sophie's sobs grow more frantic, Richard's resolve begins to crack. With a quiet sigh, he steps towards her, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he makes his way across the cemetery. He reaches her side, and for a brief second, Sophie looks up, her tear-streaked face meeting his cold, distant eyes. She doesn't recognize him, nor does she care. Her pain has consumed her to the point where nothing else matters. Richard kneels beside her, his hand hovering uncertainty before he finally places it on her shoulder. The contact seems to pull Sophie out of her own sorrow, just for a moment, and she looks at him through blurry eyes. She's startled by the gesture, unsure of who this stranger is or why he's even bothering to help her. "I'm sorry," Richard says softly, his voice lacking the warmth one would expect from someone offering comfort. "Are you okay?" Sophie, still gasping for air, shakes her head slowly. She can barely form words, her throat tight from the weight of her grief. I don't know what to do," she manages to say, her voice trembling. Richard stares at her, his eyes flicking over her ragged appearance. He can't help but feel a strange, uncomfortable sympathy for her. This woman who seems so lost, so broken, much like he feels inside. His gaze shifts down to the photograph in her hand, and something about it strikes a chord within him. It's old, faded with age, but there is a familiarity to it that he can't quite place. His heart skips a beat as he notices the worn locket she clutches, its edges scratched and battered from years of use. A chill runs down his spine, and for the briefest moment, he feels a rush of recognition. That locket. Why does it look so familiar? Before he can ask her about it, Sophie speaks again, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say goodbye, but I don't think they ever really left me. Richard's brow furrows in confusion. The words feel too cryptic, too heavy with meaning. He looks down at the locket once more, a wave of unease washing over him. There is something deeply unsettling about the way Sophie holds it. Something almost familiar. Where did you get that? Richard asks before he can stop himself, his voice betraying a hint of urgency. Sophie looks up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his steady gaze. It's mine, she says softly, her voice barely audible. It was my daughter's. Richard's heart skips again, the recognition dawning on him like a shadow creeping over the room. His face pales slightly, and he struggles to control the reaction bubbling up within him. The connection between Sophie and Eleanor, his late wife, is far more intricate than he could ever have imagined. As Sophie stumbles to her feet, still unsteady from the weight of her grief, Richard watches her with a sense of growing unease. The pieces of the puzzle are beginning to fall into place, but there's something he isn't seeing yet, something hidden beneath the surface of this unexpected encounter. As the camera pulls back to reveal the two figures standing in the misty graveyard, a quiet tension lingers in the air. Sophie, still clutching the locket, is oblivious to the turmoil in Richard's heart. And yet, something in her presence has begun to stir long-buried memories in him. Memories that will soon unravel a family secret neither of them could have ever anticipated. The mist that once blanketed the graveyard now begins to dissipate, allowing the pale morning sunlight to break through and cast a soft glow over the two figures standing amidst the rows of ancient gravestones. The air is thick with unspoken tension, as though the graveyard itself is holding its breath. Sophie, still trembling with emotion, stands shakily in front of Richard, her face a portrait of grief and determination. Her hands are clasped tightly around the locket, which glints faintly in the dim light, as if it holds some secret that only she knows. Richard, standing a few feet away, watches her intently, his mind racing with questions, a knot of unease forming in his chest. Sophie's eyes are downcast, her voice barely above a whisper as she begins to speak again, her words shaky but filled with an undeniable urgency. I didn't have a choice, she murmurs, her voice breaking with emotion. I grew up in foster care, never knowing who my real parents were. I was always told that I'd be found, that one day I'd know where I came from. She takes a deep, ragged breath, her fingers tightening around the photograph she holds. But I've never stopped searching. I've been trying to find answers, trying to understand why they left me. Richard listens quietly, his gaze never leaving her, though he remains stoic, his lips pressed into a thin line. There is something about Sophie's pain, her raw vulnerability, that unsettles him more than he cares to admit. The words she speaks resonate with an odd familiarity, as if they echo something deep within him, something long buried and forgotten. Yet he can't place it. There's too much confusion, too many questions. And in the back of his mind, a nagging suspicion begins to grow. Sophie lifts the locket in her hand, holding it up for Richard to see. Her fingers trace the delicate design, the metal worn and smooth from years of handling, and the motion is almost tender. She looks at the locket, her eyes distant, lost in memories. This was my mother's, she says softly, almost to herself. And the photograph, this is the only thing I have left of them. Her voice trembles as she speaks, and Richard's gaze shifts to the picture she holds. The photograph is old, the edges curling with age, and though the image is faded, Richard can make out two figures standing side by side, a young woman with dark, flowing hair and a man with sharp features. They stand together, their faces framed by a backdrop of a garden, a scene that seems warm and peaceful, almost too perfect to be real. Richard's stomach tightens as he studies the photo, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He doesn't recognize the people in the picture, yet something about the woman's expression, the way her eyes seem to gaze directly at him, sends a chill racing down his spine. Sophie catches his lingering glance and shifts uncomfortably, as if she's aware of the disquiet that has suddenly settled over the scene. I thought if I came here, maybe I'd find something, she says, her voice wavering. Maybe I'd find the answers I've been searching for my whole life. She looks up at Richard, her eyes red from crying but determined. You must think I'm crazy. Richard shakes his head, his lips tightening into a thin line. No, I don't think you're crazy, he replies, his voice flat. But in his mind, doubt begins to creep in, inching forward like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. He takes a step back, clearing his throat, trying to regain his composure. His mind is still reeling from Sophie's words, from the unnerving familiarity of the locket and photograph. There's a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, something he can't quite place. A strange connection he can't explain, yet it lingers like a bitter taste on his tongue. You said the locket was your mother's, Richard says slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watches Sophie. And this photograph, it's the only thing you have left of them? His voice takes on a more probing tone, though his demeanor remains calm. Sophie nods, her face a mask of sorrow. Yes, she whispers, her voice small. They never came back for me. And when I was old enough, I started searching for them. I thought if I could find them, maybe I could understand why they left. Maybe I could finally feel whole. Richard's heart begins to race as he watches Sophie, her pain palpable, her words pulling him into a world of confusion and questions he doesn't know how to navigate. There's a part of him that wants to dismiss everything, to chalk it up to coincidence. But another part, the part that has been carefully hidden beneath layers of control and decorum, starts to feel a deep, gnawing sense of unease. His eyes flicker back to the locket, his mind racing. He can't ignore the fact that something about it feels eerily familiar, the design hauntingly similar to the locket his late wife, Eleanor, used to wear. He swallows hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wants to dismiss the thought, to convince himself that there's no connection. But something inside him refuses to let go of the idea, as if the truth is just within reach, waiting to be uncovered. Sophie notices the change in his expression, the subtle shift in his demeanor, and she presses on, her voice gaining strength. I think this place has the answers. This graveyard, she says, looking around with wide, desperate eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but I feel like they're here, like their stories are buried here. And if I keep looking, I'll find them. Richard takes a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knows he should walk away. He should end this conversation and put the strange connection between Sophie and his wife out of his mind. But he can't. His curiosity, his own buried grief, compels him to listen. Tell me more about this graveyard, Richard says, his voice low, his words measured. What do you mean, their stories are buried here? Sophie hesitates, her eyes darting between Richard and the graves around them. I don't know, she admits, her voice trembling again. It's just a feeling, a hunch. Every time I come here, I feel like I'm close to something I don't understand yet. Richard's suspicions grow, the unease turning into a palpable weight in his chest. His mind is clouded with questions, but one stands out above the rest. How is this woman connected to my wife's past? The question lingers in the air, unanswered, as the silence between them grows heavier with each passing moment. Suddenly, Sophie's words cut through the silence once more. I don't know why, but I think you know something about this graveyard, she says, her eyes locking onto his. I think you've been here before, and I think you've seen something you're not telling me. Richard's breath catches in his throat. The mystery deepens, and the weight of Sophie's words threatens to unravel everything he thought he knew about his own life. The truth, it seems, is not as simple as it once appeared. And as the shadows lengthen around them, he can't shake the feeling that the answers Sophie seeks, and the answers he so desperately needs, are buried somewhere in this place, waiting to be uncovered. The silence that follows Sophie's words hangs thick between them, oppressive in its weight. Richard's mind is a storm of confusion and disbelief, but Sophie's gaze is steady, her eyes filled with something darker. Determination, yes, but also a flicker of hope, perhaps the kind that only emerges when a person believes they are finally close to a long-awaited truth. Sophie's belief in the connection between her family and Richard's late wife, Eleanor, is palpable, but Richard finds it almost impossible to believe. Everything seems too fantastical, too far-fetched to be real. Yet, as Richard turns away from Sophie's searching eyes and walks slowly back toward his car, a small voice within him urges him to look deeper. His stomach churns, a slow-burning unease that refuses to be ignored. Sophie's locket, the photograph. It's impossible to overlook the haunting similarities to Eleanor's own family treasures. A nagging sense of foreboding twists in his gut. What if Sophie's story isn't just a coincidence? What if the truth she's searching for is somehow connected to his past? Back at his family estate, Richard stands alone in the grand study, a room lined with shelves of dusty books and well-worn furniture, the rich scent of leather-bound volumes mixing with the faint, musty air of old memories. He carefully opens a locked drawer in an antique desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he retrieves the family album. The same album he's turned to countless times over the years when nostalgia, grief, or curiosity calls him to relive the past. It's a thick, weathered book, its pages filled with faded photographs and stories of family celebrations, tragedies, and milestones. With deliberate care, Richard flips through the pages, his eyes scanning the faces of ancestors he only knew through stories. But then, near the back of the album, a single image catches his attention, sending a shiver up his spine. His hands freeze, trembling slightly as he pulls the photograph from its resting place. The faces in the photo are faded, but there is no mistaking the young woman in the center. She's smiling, radiant even, but the eyes that look back at him are unmistakable. Eleanor. But it's not just Eleanor. Next to her stands a man, arms around her, his face vaguely familiar, but Richard cannot place him. He studies the photo, his heart hammering in his chest as something clicks into place. There's something in the background that draws his attention. A dark-haired child standing near Eleanor's side. The child's features are softer, younger, but Richard knows in an instant that this is the same woman, the same child Sophie had described. It's as if the past itself has risen from the depths to confront him. Richard's breath catches in his throat as the significance of the image begins to settle in. The child is too young to be Eleanor's, too young to be anyone other than a daughter. His hands shake as he flips back to the picture Sophie had shown him earlier, the one of her mother, holding that same locket, staring up at him with a haunting familiarity. The realization hits him like a punch to the gut. Sophie. Sophie is Eleanor's daughter. His mind reels, refusing to accept what is so undeniably true. The photograph in his hands, a ghost from the past, reveals everything. His legs feel weak as he stands there, clutching the album as if it's the only thing tethering him to reality. The weight of the discovery is suffocating. He thought he knew Eleanor. He thought he had known everything about her, her quiet strength, her graceful poise, her unspoken sorrow. But this secret, this child she had been forced to give up, had been buried from him, from everyone. The drive back to the graveyard is a blur. The world around Richard seems distant, like he's in a dream. He hardly notices the familiar landmarks as he passes, the well-maintained roads and overgrown fields. His mind is consumed with thoughts of Eleanor and the painful truth that's been unearthed. This woman, Sophie, standing before him, is his wife's daughter. A child Eleanor had been forced to leave behind, for reasons Richard can't yet understand. As Richard arrives at the graveyard, the sun has begun its descent, casting long, slanting shadows over the tombstones. The air feels cooler, heavier with the knowledge he's about to share. His eyes scan the rows of graves, looking for Sophie, and soon enough he spots her, sitting alone by the same gravestone, her head down. There's something almost fragile about her in this moment, as though she's on the precipice of a life-altering realization that she isn't yet ready to face. Sophie looks up as Richard approaches, her eyes tired but still brimming with that unspoken hope. She doesn't say a word, but her gaze asks the question that's been lingering between them all this time. Have you found it? Have you found the truth? Without a word, Richard reaches into his coat pocket, pulls out the photograph, and holds it before her. Sophie stares at it, her breath catching in her throat. Her fingers tremble as she takes the picture from his hand, her eyes scanning the faces frozen in time. You know her? Sophie's voice is barely above a whisper, her eyes flickering from the photo to Richard's face. This woman, she's my mother, isn't she? Richard nods, his throat tight, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Yes, he says, his voice strained, as if he's struggling to admit the truth. She's Eleanor. Your mother. He pauses, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Sophie, I had no idea. Sophie's breath catches, her hand pressing against her chest, as if the revelation is physically painful. But why didn't she ever tell me? Why didn't she come back for me? Richard's eyes are full of sorrow as he looks down at the woman who, unbeknownst to him, shares so much with the woman he loved. Eleanor was forced to give you up, he says softly, his voice thick with regret. Society, the pressures of it all. She was never allowed to raise you. And when we met, she never spoke of you, never even mentioned you to me. I didn't know. I had no idea. Tears well up in Sophie's eyes as the full weight of the revelation settles in. But why? She chokes out, her voice breaking. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she leave me? Richard's heart aches as he watches her struggle to understand the truth. He's been carrying his own guilt, his own grief for so long, but now it feels heavier than ever before. The secret Eleanor had kept buried is not just about the past. It's about their present, their future, and everything that could have been. I don't know, Richard whispers, his own tears finally slipping down his face. I don't know why, but I do know that she loved you, Sophie. I know that much. In that moment, the graveyard around them seems to fade into the background, the weight of the revelation anchoring them to the past and to each other. The connection between them, unseen but undeniable, feels like it has always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. The days after the revelation pass in a blur of restless nights and long, contemplative mornings. Richard and Sophie are bound together now, not just by blood, but by a shared history they are both struggling to comprehend. They walk into the truth slowly, step by step, as if afraid that the ground beneath them might give way at any moment. The bond they are forming feels tentative, fragile, but it's undeniably real. Each word spoken, each gesture, builds a new understanding between them, a new connection that neither could have predicted just days ago. The decision to seek out those who knew Eleanor before she married Richard is a quiet one. Neither of them speaks much on the subject. There's no need. They both understand the gravity of the task before them. For Sophie, the truth is a long time coming, a series of unanswered questions she's carried with her since childhood. For Richard, it's a journey into the past, a reminder of everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved and the secrets she had hidden from him. Neither of them is prepared for the emotional toll that this journey will take. Their first stop is a small, charming cottage on the outskirts of town, where an elderly woman named Margaret lives. Margaret was once Eleanor's childhood friend, someone who shared her dreams and her heartbreaks, someone who might hold the pieces of Eleanor's past that Richard and Sophie are both so desperately searching for. The house is a time capsule, decorated with faded pictures of Eleanor as a young girl, her smile radiant and full of hope. As they sit down with Margaret, Sophie feels a strange sense of anticipation. This is the first time she's been so close to anyone who might know her mother's life before it became a quiet secret, buried beneath the weight of a life Richard had always believed to be complete. Margaret speaks softly, her voice trembling with age as she recalls memories of Eleanor from their youth. She was always full of life, Margaret says, her eyes distant as she smiles at the memory. She loved the freedom of the open fields, the sound of the wind through the trees. But there was a sadness in her too, a quiet sorrow that followed her, even when she was happy. I never understood it, not until much later. Richard listens intently, his eyes scanning the room, for any hint of what he's missing. He never thought about Eleanor in this way. Never thought of her as someone with a past that was so full of pain, a past that was hidden from him for so many years. He watches as Margaret continues to speak, revealing bits of Eleanor's life before she married, the hopes she had for the future, and the dreams she had to let go of. Sophie sits quietly, absorbing the stories of a mother she never knew. It's bittersweet, this feeling of closeness and distance all at once. She wants so badly to reach out, to claim these pieces of Eleanor's life as her own. But the distance between them is vast, and Sophie knows she can never truly bridge the gap. She listens as Margaret tells her about the day Eleanor was forced to give her up, a day that was filled with grief and loss. Eleanor's tears were silent, but they were there, hidden behind the composure she tried to maintain. Sophie's heart breaks as she hears these stories, realizing how much her mother must have suffered, and how much love was never shared. After their visit with Margaret, Richard and Sophie move on to a second destination, the local post office. There, they discover a box of letters. Letters Eleanor had written but never sent. These letters, mostly composed in the quiet of the night when she was alone with her thoughts, were filled with regret, love, and sorrow. Some were addressed to Sophie, others to friends she'd lost touch with over the years. But all of them spoke of a woman torn between duty and love, a woman who never had the chance to tell her truth. Richard flips through the letters with trembling hands, reading the words Eleanor had written all those years ago. The regret is palpable. In one letter, Eleanor confesses her fear of being a mother, how the world around her seemed so cold and unforgiving. In another, she writes of her longing for Sophie, the daughter she was forced to leave behind. "I never wanted to abandon you," she wrote in the final letter, the ink smudged by tears. "But I had no choice. I hope, one day, you'll understand." Sophie takes a deep breath, her fingers brushing over the fragile paper. She feels a connection to Eleanor that she's never felt before, a longing for the mother who, though absent, had always been present in the depths of her heart. The realization that her mother's love had never been absent, despite the distance, is a bittersweet comfort. But it doesn't answer all the questions. There are still so many things Sophie needs to understand. Why did Eleanor never come for her? Why was she forced to give up the child she so clearly loved? As they leave the post office, the weight of the letters in Sophie's hands is heavier than she expected. Each one is a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the woman who was once her mother. The question of why hangs in the air like an unanswered prayer. Sophie doesn't expect to find the perfect answer, but she knows now that the love between a mother and a child is not defined by proximity. It's defined by the way it shapes a person, by the way it lingers even after years of separation. In the days that follow, Richard and Sophie spend more time together, sharing memories of Eleanor as they both slowly begin to heal. Richard tells Sophie about their life together, about the moments that defined their marriage, the late-night conversations, the quiet mornings spent reading the newspaper, the way Eleanor always made him laugh even when life seemed too serious. Sophie, in turn, speaks of the years she spent searching for answers, of the way she always wondered who her mother was and why she had been left behind. Each story they share is a step toward healing, a step toward forgiveness, and a fragile bond is formed between them. A bond neither of them ever expected. But the hardest part of the journey is yet to come. Richard decides to introduce Sophie to his family, to her half-siblings, the children he and Eleanor had together. It's a decision he knows will be difficult, but he feels that Sophie deserves the chance to know them. As they gather in the family home, the atmosphere is thick with tension. Richard's children are confused, skeptical, and hesitant to embrace this new, unexpected truth. Sophie's presence unsettles them, and there's an awkwardness in the air that none of them can seem to shake. Sophie stands at the edge of the room, unsure of her place in this new family. She watches Richard, who is doing his best to smooth over the awkwardness, but there's only so much he can do. His children don't know her, and they don't know what to make of the fact that this woman, this stranger, is now a part of their lives. But through the tension and uncertainty, there's a glimmer of hope. Sophie speaks softly, introducing herself to each of them. sharing her story, her grief, and her longing to belong. It's not perfect, it's not smooth, but it's real. And in that moment, Richard knows that even though the road ahead will be difficult, they are all on the same path now, walking toward a future where the truth, no matter how painful, can finally bring them together. The quiet stillness of the graveyard returns, but it's no longer the same haunting place it once was. The fog that had settled over the stones on the first day Sophie visited has lifted, and the sun's rays break through the early morning mist, casting long shadows across the weathered graves. This time, the air feels different, a sense of closure settling into the very soil beneath their feet. Richard stands beside Sophie, both of them looking at the fresh stone that now marks Eleanor's resting place. The new headstone is simple yet meaningful, elegant, etched with the name Eleanor Lawson, along with a second inscription beneath it, a name long missing from the narrative of her life, Sophie Lawson. It's a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had been hidden for so long, a truth that finally connects them, even in death. The name engraved there is more than just a symbol. It's the key to Sophie's identity, to her sense of belonging in a world that had kept her at arm's length for too long. Richard places his hand gently on the stone, his gaze lingering on Eleanor's name before turning to Sophie. His voice is steady but thick with emotion as he speaks. She never knew, Sophie. I should have known. I should have found you. But at least now, you have your place. Here, with her, with us. Sophie looks at him, her expression a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. She hasn't spoken much since they arrived at the graveyard, her thoughts swirling, trying to process everything. The life she's been given now feels different. Not just because she's discovered her true parentage, but because she's finally learned what it means to be seen, to be acknowledged. I never knew her, Sophie says quietly, the words almost lost in the gentle wind that rustles the leaves around them. But I feel like I've always been searching for her, for a piece of me that was missing. Her eyes trace the engraving of Eleanor's name, and for the first time in her life, Sophie feels the weight of both loss and healing. The graveyard isn't just a place of endings anymore. It's a place of connection, where the threads of her life weave together in unexpected ways. It's a place where Sophie's past, filled with unanswered questions and uncertainty, finally meets the future, where the story of her mother's sacrifice and the quiet love that had existed between them for all these years is no longer hidden. I never wanted to abandon you, Eleanor's letter had said, and now, standing at her grave, Sophie feels that love, even if it's too late to hold her mother's hand. The pain of the years spent without answers begins to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that love transcends time, transcends circumstances. Richard watches her, his face etched with the regret of years spent in the dark, but there's something else there now, a flicker of hope. The past, as painful as it's been, is beginning to find its place in the light. There's no perfect reconciliation with the truth. There's no undoing the lost years, but there's something about standing here, side by side, that feels like the beginning of something new. The truth, in all its messy, complicated beauty, has finally made its way into the open. Sophie takes a deep breath, her eyes still locked on the grave. Her voice is calm, but it carries an unmistakable strength. I wish I could have known her. But I know now. I know that she loved me, even if she couldn't be with me. Her fingers touch the cool stone, a soft caress as she says the words that have lingered in her heart for so long. I forgive her. Richard turns to face her fully, a small but sincere smile tugging at his lips. I'm proud of you, proud of what you've found. There's a pause, and then he adds, his voice thick with emotion, and I'll never stop making it right. You're my daughter, Sophie. And nothing, not time, not distance, not any of it can change that now. For the first time, Sophie allows herself to truly believe it. She turns her head toward him, her eyes searching his face, as if to make sure the words are real. There's no longer a shadow between them, no longer any hesitation. The truth has been laid bare, and in the aftermath, something new has been built between them, a bond that neither the past nor the future can easily tear apart. I never thought I'd hear those words, Sophie admits, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. But I'm glad I did. Richard, standing beside her, is no longer the man who didn't know he had a daughter, who never understood the weight of the secret Eleanor carried. He is a man who's learning to be a father, who's learning what it means to make up for lost time. And for the first time in a long while, he feels hopeful about the future. But the journey doesn't end here. They walk away from the grave together, the air between them lighter now, as if the weight of all those years has finally been lifted. The road ahead is uncertain, full of challenges they have yet to face. But for the first time, Richard feels like he's not walking alone. He's not walking with the regret of the past looming over him. He's walking with Sophie, a daughter he never knew he had, but now can't imagine living without. As they reach the car, Richard places his hand on Sophie's shoulder, an unspoken gesture of reassurance. He knows this is just the beginning. He knows there will be days when the past feels overwhelming, when the hurt of lost time lingers in the corners of their hearts. But there is a new chapter to write now, one where they are no longer strangers, but father and daughter, linked by the truth and by the love that comes from understanding each other's pain. I'll help you, Richard promises, his voice steady with conviction. I'll help you rebuild your life. You don't have to do it alone. Sophie nods, her heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in years, she feels like she has a future, one that's filled with possibilities, with a family that is finally hers. The truth has been the key to unlock a door that she never thought she'd find. But now that it's open, Sophie is ready to walk through it. As they drive away, the graveyard fades into the distance, a place of endings now turned into a place of beginnings. The sun is setting, casting a warm glow over the world, and for the first time, Sophie feels at peace. She's found what she's been searching for, and though the road ahead will be long, she knows that she's not walking it alone. And with that, Sophie finally begins to imagine a future where the past no longer defines her. A future where she can rebuild, where she can embrace the family she never knew she had, and where the truth, painful as it was, will be the foundation of something new.